When people think of Texas, tall mountains aren't usually the first thing to come to mind, but there are a number of ranges in its western extremity near the border with Mexico. Perhaps most notable are the Chisos Mountains, which rise like an island in the middle of Big Bend National Park. Due to its remoteness, Big Bend is one of the least visited national parks in the United States. I've seen the park from the ground on a past hiking trip, and it truly is a magical place. But as I searched for new frontiers to reach in my trike, I wondered if it would be possible to experience its majesty from the air. Driving to the park is about a 10-hour journey for me by car, but I determined that I could fly there from my home airport in 7 to 8 hours depending on wind, making it comfortably doable within a day. What's more, there is an airport just outside the park boundary at the Lajitas Golf Resort. The airport allows guests to reach the resort by charter jet, given that there is no airline service anywhere near it, but it's open to general aviation traffic as well, with no fees for resort guests. The resort provides complimentary shuttles between the airport and resort grounds, and with lodging, restaurants, and a general store on site, as well as avgas available at the airport, Lajitas looked to be a very convenient place to make an overnight stop. Because lodging here is expensive, I'd only stay one night, exploring part of the park on my way in and the rest on the way out the next morning. Completing the flight safely would require 2 fuel stops. There are really only 2 last stop options for fuel before reaching the park, Ozona to the north and Del Rio to the south. The southerly route would be about 15 minutes shorter, but I ultimately opted for the northerly for 2 reasons. First, given that from Del Rio I'd have to go around the bend in the Rio Grande to avoid crossing into Mexico with its associated complications, the final leg would be about 20 minutes longer than approaching from Ozona. Given that there are no fuel options between either airport and my destination, I wanted to have as much fuel reserve as possible. Second, Del Rio is situated under the Charlie Shelf of Laughlin Air Force Base. Given the high volume of jet trainer traffic in the area, I would not have attempted going there without first contacting Del Rio Approach, and as with my Shreveport flight, I'd like more experience talking to ATC in less stressful airspace before attempting something like that. In addition to a fuel stop at Ozona, I'd also stop at Fredericksburg on the way in. For the return flight, I'd reverse my route. Although I have a fair amount of experience flying in mountains in a hang glider and have taken them as high as 12,000 feet MSL, this would be my first time flying in mountains in a trike, as well as the highest altitude by far I take one up to. The tallest peak in the park has an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet MSL, and if I wanted to keep 2,000 feet over it, this would mean flying as high as 10,000 feet. To prepare for this trip, I flew to 10,000 feet over Wharton to monitor aircraft and engine performance at high altitude. I didn't want the first time I did this to be in a remote area far from home, in case there were any surprises. I climbed at 5,400 RPM and was still getting a 500 foot per minute climb rate when I reached 10,000 feet, so I was pleased to find I had plenty of power with the 100 horsepower engine. Engine temperatures stayed comfortably within nominal ranges throughout the flight. True airspeed increased by about 10 miles per hour from the bottom to the top of the climb. In addition to my high-altitude flight, I also studied up on mountain flying and simulated my routes around the park in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which integrates with my EFB. I'm a firm believer that the better prepared you are, the less stressful new situations will be, allowing you to better enjoy the experience. With preparations done, it was now just a matter of waiting for perfect weather. Clear skies were ideal, as I'd have to get an early start and low clouds are often an issue early in the day at Wharton. I also wanted light winds in the park to limit mechanical turbulence from the mountains, but it actually turns out that Ozona was the limiting factor for me. The place always seemed to be gusty, and I would have to land there midday during peak thermal turbulence, exacerbated by the fact that the area is very dry. Thus, I wanted to wait for 2 days in a row of lightish winds there. I got the window I was waiting for after 2 back-to-back fronts left a large high-pressure system sitting over the whole region. I'd have a bit of a net headwind on both the outgoing and returning flights, putting each day around 8 hours of total flying, but you can't have everything. I called the Lajitas airport manager, Gary, the day before my arrival to make arrangements. When he asked about my aircraft type, I told him it was a weight shift trike. He unsurprisingly had no idea what I was talking about, but I was relieved that he had no issue with it, and later told me that he had some gyros fly in recently. I mention this because while public airports in the U.S. cannot discriminate against aircraft based on type, private airports are free to allow or bar whomever they want, and some private airports prohibit trikes for whatever reason. I stayed in Wharton the night before my departure so I could get an early start. I was in the air at 7 a.m. just after sunrise. Temps were in the 40s on the ground, but 10 degrees warmer at altitude due to the overnight inversion. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and I enjoyed smooth air all the way to Fredericksburg. Note the 3 helicopters parked here. And an interesting coincidence, they were actually on their way to Lajitas as well, and I'd catch sight of them in the distance on my way into the park. There wasn't much to look at between Fredericksburg and Azona, and I arrived at Azona on schedule. The landscape gets a lot more interesting south of Azona. Numerous dirt roads here provided landing options in a pinch. This ridge marks the national park boundary. And here we come to the northeastern corner of the Chisos Mountains. The village below is Panther Junction, home to the park's main visitor center. This road leads into the Chisos Basin, the heart of the park. My hope was to fly along the northern and western sides of the mountains on the way in, and the southern and eastern sides the next morning on the way out, but this would depend in part on the wind, as I didn't want to be in the lee side of the range. Winds were light out of the west with pleasantly smooth air, so I was able to proceed as planned. This opening in the mountains is known as the window, as it frames a view out into the desert from the basin. Here we're looking the other way into the basin. The air was so smooth, I decided to continue to the south rim, the ultimate destination and the park's signature hike. I continued east until I started hitting some small bumps from the hills west of me. I decided that was my cue to head to Lajitas. When I was about 10 minutes out, Gary radioed me to ask my ETA. Presumably he was watching my ADS-B track. The previous day I told him to expect me between 4 and 4:30 p.m., and I landed on schedule at 4:10. Gary was waiting for me and marshaled me to the fuel pumps. They're full service only, but he did a great job getting me topped off. Fuel is very expensive here, but that's to be expected given how remote it is. The van behind Gary was my ride. The driver was also awaiting my arrival and ready to grab my luggage as soon as I parked. Gary put me up in the massive hangar for the night with the 3 helicopters that arrived before me. My accommodations were very nice, though I'd have been content with a Motel 6. I had a pleasant dinner and hit the hay early as I was getting another early start the next day. I rode out to the airport at 7 a.m. and Gary had the hangar opened and ready for me. I was really impressed with the service I got and can wholeheartedly recommend Lajitas to any pilots wanting to stop there. I was in the air at my planned departure time of 8:30 a.m. Before returning to the Chisos Mountains, I first headed due south to check out Santa Elena Canyon, where the Rio Grande cuts through a 1,500-foot tall escarpment. The far side of the river is Mexico, so I made sure to stay on the U.S. side. I kept my airspeed trimmed at 65 miles per hour until I left the park, partly to give me more time to enjoy the scenery, partly to conserve fuel, and partly to facilitate climbing, which I'd be doing a lot of on this leg. After seeing the canyon from above, I made a pass by its opening. This formation is known as the mule ears. From there I made my way to the southern extreme of the Chisos Range. To my knowledge there are no roads or trails here, so it's a very remote part of a very remote park. This peak is named Elephant Tusk. Climbers sometimes summit it, but most people only see it from a distance. From there I started climbing to make one more pass on the south rim. While there are no airspace restrictions in the park for private aircraft, the FAA requests that pilots fly 2,000 feet from the terrain over national parks. My EFIS can give height over ground using its terrain database, which made complying with this request easy. The mountains here rise over 5,000 feet above the surrounding terrain. Winds were generally out of the west, but very light. As I made my way to the east of the mountains, I found the rising sun created an upslope flow, and I enjoyed smooth air all morning. I decided to make one more pass on the north side of the mountains since the sun was in a bad spot on my trip in. Here's the point where I finally said farewell to Big Ben and headed in the direction of Azona. The inversion kept thermals below 2,000 feet all morning, making for smooth air all the way to Azona. Things started getting feisty once I descended to pattern altitude, however, and my landing at Azona was the most difficult I'd done all year. I was glad I waited for light wind here, as I wouldn't want to have to deal with strong gusts on top of this. Fortunately, the 6,000-foot runway gave me plenty of room to wait for an opportunity to set down without having to do a go-around. My landing at Fredericksburg ended up being a handful as well, but things began to calm down once I took off again, and the final leg of the trip was lovely. I returned to beautiful conditions at Wharton just before sunset. This trip was the most epic thing I've done in a trike by far, and while I don't think anything will be able to top the scenery of flying through Yosemite Valley in a hang glider, Big Bend was easily the second most beautiful place I've flown over. It's also undoubtedly the most scenic destination reachable to me within a day of flying, so don't expect me to top this one anytime soon.